If he paused a minute to remove the bias in his heart, maybe all these wouldn't have happened. Sheriff Russell Sullivan saw Christina Elias as just another black woman with a parking excuse near a faded fire hydrant. An easier lesson in compliance. He had 16 years of badge authority, a documented history of racial confrontations, and the certainty that came from untouchable power in Waverly, Iowa. Then came the handcuffs, the false DUI accusation, the booking process that should have ended with silence and submission. What he couldn't see behind that composed face was the constitutional authority that would dismantle his career, Iowa's state attorney. He assumed his audio-disabled body cam would protect him, like it had for 4 years of discriminatory stops. He was catastrophically wrong. And in 37 minutes of crystal-clear footage that uploaded automatically to Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation servers, footage governed by a firmware update he never knew existed, small-town racism would collide with state-level authority in a takedown that would expose a pattern of targeting that had extracted freedom, dignity, and justice from dozens of minority victims across Bremer County. If you are ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let's continue. The October afternoon had stretched quiet across Waverly's residential streets for 20 minutes before Sheriff Russell Sullivan finished the welfare check call on Birch Avenue. The dispatch had been routine: elderly resident, 3 days of uncollected mail, concerned neighbor, resolved in 8 minutes when the woman answered her door in a bathrobe, apologetic about forgetting to notify the post office before her granddaughter's visit. Sullivan climbed back into his cruiser at 4:52 p.m., the kind of non-incident that padded shift reports without requiring paperwork. He pulled away from the curb, radio silent, the afternoon settling into the slow drift toward end of shift. 2 more hours of patrol. Maybe a speeding ticket on Highway 3 if someone from Cedar Falls forgot the speed limit dropped to 35 entering town. Maybe nothing at all except the familiar streets, the predictable rhythm of authority exercised in a place where nothing much changed except the seasons. Sullivan turned onto Maple Street, cutting through the residential grid toward the station, when he spotted the vehicle parked ahead on the right side. A silver Honda Civic, late model, positioned beside a fire hydrant that had seen better decades. The hydrant stood perhaps 4 feet tall, its red paint oxidized to dull orange-brown, peeling away in strips that exposed rust-corroded metal beneath. No curb marking. No yellow paint designating restricted space. Just the hydrant itself, half forgotten by municipal maintenance, standing solitary against the leaf-strewn curb. Sullivan's attention fixed on the Honda's rear bumper. The gap between vehicle and hydrant looked narrow. Too narrow, probably. An obstruction complaint waiting to happen if the volunteer fire department ever needed hydrant access on this block, which they wouldn't, because Maple Street was residential and sleepy, and the last structure fire had occurred 4 years ago when the Hendersons' garage caught from a space heater left running overnight. But the law was the law. Iowa Code Section 321.358 prohibited parking within 5 feet of a fire hydrant, one of the shortest distances in the nation, a quirk of state legislation that most drivers didn't know about. Sullivan knew it, had cited it dozens of times over 16 years. Easy revenue, easier compliance when people realized arguing meant getting towed. He activated his emergency lights with a practiced tap, the red and blue sequence igniting across his windshield as he positioned the cruiser diagonally behind the Honda, blocking its exit. The engine note of authority, the visual declaration that this stop was official, recorded, backed by the power of Bremer County's Sheriff's Department. Sullivan stepped out into the cool afternoon air, his uniform crisp despite 7 hours of wear, boots mirror polished, from habit formed in his first year of service. He was 51 years old, 6 feet tall, carrying the kind of weight that suggested authority more than athleticism. His face showed the weathering of outdoor work, sun lines around the eyes, a permanent squint from years of scanning streets, a jaw that set itself into certainty before his brain finished processing information. He approached the Honda slowly, his right hand resting near his duty belt in the practiced gesture of readiness, his left hand free and visible. Standard approach protocol for a parking violation, though Sullivan's version always carried an edge of confrontation, a readiness to escalate if challenged. The Honda's windows were clear, empty interior. No occupant to contact directly, which meant locating the owner and issuing the citation in person. Sullivan circled the vehicle, examining its position from multiple angles. The rear bumper sat close to the hydrant, definitely within the 5-foot threshold. He crouched beside the gap, eyeballing the distance with the confidence of someone who'd made these judgments hundreds of times. Close. Definitely close. He stood and looked up and down Maple Street, scanning for anyone who might claim ownership. The block stretched quiet in both directions, houses with closed doors, driveways empty of activity, the particular stillness of a Thursday afternoon when most residents were still at work or occupied indoors. No one visible. No one approaching the vehicle. Sullivan was about to call in the plate number for a tow authorization when he saw her. A black woman in her early 30s, professional attire suggesting office work or business casual, carrying a small canvas grocery bag in one hand. She'd emerged from between two houses 1 block north, walking with purposeful stride along the sidewalk, heading in the direction of the Honda. Sullivan watched her approach, watched her notice the emergency lights, watched her pace slow fractionally as she registered the scene, her vehicle, his cruiser, the obvious implication of enforcement in progress. She continued walking, closing the distance with measured calm, no panic or sudden direction change. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable at this distance. The grocery bag hung easily from her left hand, its weight suggesting something light inside bread, maybe, or produce. When she reached the Honda, she stopped on the sidewalk 10 feet from Sullivan, her body language communicating neither guilt nor defensiveness. Just attention. Waiting. Sullivan positioned himself between her and the vehicle, establishing physical control of the space without blocking her completely. His badge caught the afternoon light, a 5-pointed star with sheriff engraved across its center, 16 years of county authority compressed into polished metal. He activated his body-worn camera with a deliberate tap to the unit mounted on his chest. The small LED indicator shifted from amber to solid red, recording in 1080p resolution, timestamp synchronized with GPS coordinates, data uploading in real time to the Bremer County Evidence Server according to Iowa Administrative Code protocols. Sullivan's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who delivered this line countless times before, demanding license and registration while informing the woman she was parked illegally within 5 feet of a fire hydrant in violation of state code. Christina Elias met his gaze directly, her expression still calm, and explained that Iowa Code, Section 321.358 permitted parking within 5 feet provided the distance exceeded the minimum threshold, which her vehicle did. She'd measured it at 6 feet, 4 inches before exiting earlier. Sullivan's jaw tightened. The explanation came too smooth, too precise, the kind of legal sight that suggested someone who thought they could talk their way out of a violation. He'd heard it before, from drivers who'd Googled parking laws and thought that made them attorneys. It never worked. It just made the stop longer, the citation more justified when he proved them wrong. He retrieved a measuring tape from his cruiser, a retractable 25-foot model he kept specifically for these disputes. Christina watched him extend the tape from the Honda's rear bumper to the hydrant's center valve, his movements deliberate and careful. The tape showed 6 feet, 7 inches, technically legal, technically beyond the 5-foot minimum. Sullivan stared at the measurement for 3 seconds, his mind cycling through options. The law was clear, the distance unambiguous. Most officers would have acknowledged the error, killed the lights, apologized for the confusion, and driven away with nothing more than minor embarrassment. Russell Sullivan was not most officers. Something in Christina's calm demeanor triggered the familiar resentment that lived just beneath his professional surface, the sense that people like her, people who cited laws and spoke in measured tones and didn't show proper deference, were the real problem with modern policing. That respect had eroded. That authority no longer commanded automatic submission, that his 16 years of service somehow mattered less than her printed code section. He retracted the measuring tape and shifted his attention from the parking violation to Christina herself. His nostrils flared slightly as he stepped closer, invading the conversational space between them, and announced he smelled alcohol on her breath, that he had reasonable suspicion of impaired driving, that she would submit to field sobriety testing immediately. Christina's expression didn't change, though something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of exactly where this encounter was heading. She stated clearly that she had not consumed alcohol, that she'd driven directly from her office in Des Moines to visit her grandmother 2 blocks away, that the grocery bag contained bread and milk, nothing more. Sullivan ordered her to set down the bag and step away from the vehicle. His hand moved to his duty belt, fingers brushing the handcuff case with practiced familiarity. His voice hardened, the tone shifting from official to aggressive, carrying undertones that had nothing to do with traffic law and everything to do with control. Christina complied, placing the grocery bag on the sidewalk and stepping into the open space, Sullivan indicated with a gesture. She stood with her hands visible at her sides, her posture upright but non-threatening, her face composed despite the escalation unfolding around her. Sullivan administered the field sobriety tests with mechanical precision, horizontal gaze, nystagmus, walk and turn, one-leg stand. Christina performed each test flawlessly, her movements balanced and controlled, her responses appropriate to every instruction, no impairment, no indication of alcohol consumption, nothing that would justify the accusation Sullivan had made. The evidence didn't matter. Sullivan's expression darkened as Christina completed the final test, his frustration building with each successful performance. He'd expected submission or error, the kind of nervous failure that people showed when confronted with authority they couldn't challenge. Instead, he'd gotten perfect compliance and legal precision, a combination that felt like mockery even though Christina's demeanor remained respectful throughout. The body cam recorded everything, the tests, the results, Sullivan's tightening jaw, the shift in his breathing that suggested anger barely contained. What the camera captured, with perfect clarity, what Sullivan believed his routine audio disabling would later erase, was the moment his bias crystallized into action. He ordered Christina to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The command came sharp and sudden, brooking no discussion. Christina's eyes widened fractionally, not fear, but recognition of the line being crossed. She complied, turning slowly, hands positioning themselves for the handcuffs she knew were coming. Sullivan's hands moved with practiced efficiency, though the pressure he applied to the steel cuffs exceeded protocol by measurable degrees. The ratchets clicked closed against Christina's wrists with deliberate tightness, the metal biting into skin, creating immediate pressure points that would leave marks within minutes. Standard procedure called for 1 finger's width between cuff and wrist. Sullivan left no space at all. Christina's breath caught, involuntary response to pain, but she remained silent. The body cam recorded the excessive tightness, the angle of Sullivan's hands, the visible wince that crossed her face before she controlled it. Evidence accumulating in digital storage, time-stamped and geotagged, waiting. Sullivan guided Christina to his cruiser with a hand on her upper arm, the grip firm enough to control without technically constituting excessive force. He opened the rear door and instructed her to sit, watching as she maneuvered into the cage-separated back seat with handcuffed hands and maintained dignity. The door closed with the solid thunk of institutional authority, sealing her inside the space where hundreds of detainees had sat before her. Then Sullivan returned to the Honda, his body cam still recording, and began a vehicle search he had no legal justification to conduct. He opened the driver's door unlocked, because Christina had been planning to return in 15 minutes, and systematically examined the interior, glove compartment, center console, door pockets. Under the seats, in the center console, beneath a collection of pens and charging cables, Sullivan found Christina's credentials wallet, Iowa State Attorney identification, official seal of the Attorney General's office, laminated card with her photograph and title, Christina Elias, State Attorney, Criminal Division. Sullivan stared at the identification for 5 seconds, his expression frozen in the particular stillness that precedes panic. His mind raced through implications: the arrest of a state official, the body cam footage, the parking violation that had never existed, the DUI accusation he couldn't substantiate, everything he'd done in the past 17 minutes, now illuminated in the harsh light of consequences. Most officers would have released her immediately, would have manufactured an apology, uncuffed her hands, blamed a misunderstanding, and prayed the incident would dissolve into professional courtesy. Most officers understood when they'd made a career-ending error and possessed the survival instinct to retreat. Russell Sullivan was not most officers. His jaw set, his hands closed, the credentials, wallet, and shoved it into his duty belt pocket with deliberate force. His eyes scanned the Honda's interior one final time before he slammed the door and returned to the cruiser, sliding into the driver's seat with movements that communicated decision rather than doubt. Whatever happened next, he'd committed to the arrest. Backing down now would be admission of error, and error meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the erosion of authority he'd spent 16 years building. Christina Elias might be state attorney, but she was also a black woman, in his custody, in his county, under his control. The body cam would show a lawful arrest, professional conduct, justified suspicion. The audio, the slurs he'd muttered, the racial undertones that had colored his tone, the excessive force of the handcuffs would be erased before anyone reviewed the footage, just like it had been for 4 years of similar stops. Sullivan had disabled body cam audio 73 times since the department received the units in 2020. Simple procedure: access the settings menu, toggle the audio capture to standby mode, continue recording video only. The department's outdated firmware allowed individual officer control, a feature that had survived multiple updates because no one in Bremer County's IT infrastructure had prioritized body cam protocols over server maintenance and budget constraints. What Sullivan couldn't know, was that Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation had pushed a mandatory firmware update to all county sheriff departments 3 months earlier. The update had been implemented during overnight maintenance windows, silent and automatic, designed specifically to combat evidence tampering that had surfaced in corruption investigations across 4 counties. The new firmware eliminated local audio control, locked settings behind state-level administrative credentials, and activated full continuous recording with tamper-resistant protocols. Sullivan's body cam had recorded every word of the encounter in crystalline audio clarity, every tone, every slur, every moment of bias crystallizing into force. The camera continued recording as Sullivan started the engine and pulled away from Maple Street, Christina Elias sitting motionless in the back seat, her wrists aching from metal that had been tightened beyond necessity, her mind already processing the legal dimensions of what had just occurred. She'd been arrested for parking legally within Iowa's 5-foot statute, accused of DUI without evidence, handcuffed with excessive force, searched without probable cause, all while holding the office of state attorney, the position that gave her authority over criminal prosecutions throughout Iowa's judicial system, all while possessing expertise in the exact transparency protocols now recording her arrest. Christina's reflection stared back at her from the cruiser's rear window, a black woman in professional attire, trapped behind steel mesh, experiencing the reality that countless minority drivers had described in complaints that went nowhere. The humiliation was familiar. The powerlessness was familiar. The specific flavor of racial targeting dressed in legal procedure was familiar to anyone who'd lived while black in America. What was unfamiliar, what Sullivan had catastrophically failed to recognize, was the authority behind that reflection, the years of legal training, the cases she'd prosecuted, the oversight she maintained over law enforcement practices across the state. The relationships she'd built with Iowa's Attorney General, the DCI, the judicial system that would review this arrest with microscopic attention. The body cam captured her face in the rearview mirror, composed, watchful, resilient, waiting. The footage uploaded in real-time packets to state servers, each frame time-stamped and secured behind encryption that prevented local deletion. The audio streamed alongside video, crystal-clear recordings of everything Sullivan had said, everything he'd done, everything his bias had refused to recognize as the catastrophic error it was. Christina shifted slightly in the too tight handcuffs, feeling circulation restrict in her wrists. She thought about her grandmother waiting 2 blocks away, expecting her granddaughter's visit, unaware that a simple grocery delivery had transformed into detention. She thought about the bread and milk sitting in the canvas bag on Maple Street's sidewalk, abandoned in the escalation. She thought about Sullivan's face when he'd seen her state attorney identification and chosen to proceed anyway. chosen bias over survival, chosen 16 years of unchecked authority over the wisdom to recognize power he couldn't control. The cruiser accelerated toward Bremer County Station, carrying Christina Elias into custody and Russell Sullivan toward consequences he couldn't begin to comprehend. Behind them, on Maple Street, the faded fire hydrant stood silent beneath October afternoon light, an iron witness to the moment institutional racism had selected the wrong target. The drive to Bremer County Sheriff's Station consumed 11 minutes of Iowa highway, during which Sullivan's body cam recorded what he believed was safely muted testimony. The audio capture system, locked in active mode by firmware he'd never reviewed, preserved every muttered justification, every frustrated exhalation, every word that stripped away professional veneer and exposed the bias beneath. Sullivan's hands gripped the steering wheel with tension that whitened his knuckles at the joints. His eyes tracked the center line with mechanical focus, but his mind cycled through the problem now handcuffed in his back seat. State Attorney. The title repeated in his consciousness like an alarm he couldn't silence. Not just an attorney, state attorney, which meant authority that extended beyond courtrooms into oversight, into departmental review, into the exact mechanisms designed to investigate officers who stepped over lines he'd just sprinted past. The muttering began 4 minutes into the drive, low enough that Sullivan probably believed the words stayed private. His lips moved with bitter commentary about people who thought positions made them untouchable, about legal credentials that didn't change the reality of who belonged where, about respect that had been eroded by people who didn't understand that authority deserved deference, regardless of whose name appeared on an ID card. The words themselves carried clear meaning. The tone sharp with resentment, weighted with racial animus, made subtext text. The body cam's microphone array captured everything at broadcast quality fidelity, filtered through noise cancellation algorithms that isolated Sullivan's voice from road noise and engine rumble. Digital evidence accumulating in 16-bit audio files, time-stamped to millisecond precision, uploading in compressed packets to Iowa DCI servers, where retention protocols would preserve them for 7 years minimum, under administrative code. Christina herself had helped refine during her tenure, reviewing transparency, legislation. Christina sat motionless in the cage-separated rear compartment, her wrists positioned awkwardly behind her back, circulation restricted by handcuffs that had been tightened past professional standards. The steel bit into her skin with steady pressure, creating contact points that would bloom into visible bruising within the hour. She could feel the onset of nerve compression in her left-hand fingers beginning to tingle, thumb growing numb, the familiar warning signs of restraints applied with punitive force rather than procedural necessity. She said nothing. Her face remained composed, despite discomfort, her eyes tracking the passing landscape through side windows that had been modified to prevent opening from inside. The silence was tactical. Everything she said could be used to construct a narrative. Sullivan would try to weaponize resistance, attitude, failure to comply. Better to remain quiet, to document internally, to preserve her testimony for context where it would matter. The station appeared ahead at 5:17 p.m., a single-story brick structure set back from Highway 3 behind a parking lot that held 4 marked cruisers and 2 civilian vehicles. The building dated from the 1982nd, its architecture suggesting functionality over aesthetics, flat roof, minimal windows, an entrance marked by county seals, and an American flag hanging motionless in still evening air. Bremer County operated with a staff of 19 sworn officers, covering 437 square miles of territory, their jurisdiction spanning 6 municipalities and serving a population that remained 94% white according to the most recent census data. Sullivan parked in the Sallyport, the secured vehicle entrance used for prisoner transport, and killed the engine. He sat for 3 seconds, hands still on the wheel, breathing deliberately through his nose. The body cam recorded his hesitation, the brief moment where decision could still become retreat. Then he opened his door, and the moment passed. Christina watched through the steel mesh as Sullivan circled to the rear passenger door and opened it with a hand that gripped the handle harder than necessary. He ordered her out with a gesture, his voice clipped and official, the tone stripped of the muttered commentary that had filled the drive. Professional Sullivan had returned. The version designed for witnesses and documentation, though his eyes carried residual anger that professional training couldn't completely mask. Christina maneuvered out of the vehicle with difficulty, her balance compromised by handcuffed hands and restricted circulation. Sullivan gripped her upper arm, the same grip from Maple Street, firm and controlling, and guided her through the Sallyport's interior door into the station's processing area. The booking room smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, its walls painted institutional beige and decorated with mandatory posting of rights and procedures. A processing desk occupied the center of the space, its surface cluttered with forms, a fingerprint scanner, and a desktop computer running case management software. Behind the desk stood Deputy Lucas Torres, 31 years old, 7 years with Bremer County, currently assigned to evening shift intake processing. Torres looked up as Sullivan entered with Christina in custody. His expression shifted through recognition not of Christina specifically, not yet, but of the scenario's particulars. Black woman in handcuffs, professional attire, Sullivan's body language, broadcasting defensive aggression. Torres had processed enough of Sullivan's arrests to recognize the pattern. Sullivan's voice carried forced casualness as he explained the charges. Parking violation escalated to suspected DUI, combative attitude, failure to provide satisfactory identification despite eventually producing state attorney credentials, which Sullivan characterized as potentially fraudulent pending verification. The narrative construction was smooth and practiced, each element designed to justify escalation while remaining technically within bounds of officer discretion. Torres listened without comment, his face carefully neutral. He gestured for Christina to approach the processing desk, his movements professional and measured. As Sullivan removed the handcuffs, Torres's eyes tracked to Christina's wrists, noting the deep red impressions where steel had compressed tissue beyond normal restraint pressure. The marks were visible and distinct parallel grooves that would photograph clearly evidence of force exceeding policy standards. Torres's training included injury documentation as mandatory protocol for all bookings. He retrieved a digital camera from the desk drawer and photographed Christina's wrists from multiple angles, the flash illuminating bruising that had already begun to darken at the compression points. Each photograph was time-stamped and automatically uploaded to the case file, creating a parallel evidence stream that would exist independent of Sullivan's narrative. Christina submitted to the documentation with the same composed silence she'd maintained throughout. Her face showed neither complaint nor commentary, just patient endurance. But when Torres asked the standard question about medical attention, her eyes met his directly, and something in that contact communicated volumes recognition, perhaps, or the specific understanding that passes between people who've navigated institutional power from opposite sides of authority. Torres processed the booking with careful attention to procedure, fingerprints, photographs, property inventory that included Christina's phone, wallet, car keys, and the state attorney identification that Sullivan had pocketed and now surrendered to evidence logging with visible reluctance. Torres examined the ID under the desk's task light, comparing the photograph to Christina's face, noting the official seals and lamination quality that distinguished genuine credentials from fabrications. His expression remained neutral, but his fingers paused fractionally on the ID card's surface. Recognition clicked into place, not from law enforcement interaction, but from a mandatory training session 3 months earlier at Iowa's Peace Officer Academy. Christina had been the guest lecturer on prosecutorial discretion and evidence integrity, her presentation covering transparency, protocols, and the relationship between state attorneys and county law enforcement. Torres had attended, had taken notes, had remembered her emphasis on body cam preservation and officer accountability. Now she stood on the other side of the processing desk, handcuff marks visible on her wrists, booked on charges that made no procedural sense if examined beyond Sullivan's narrative. Torres's mind raced through implications: the arrest of a state official, the body cam footage that should exist, the documentation requirements that would trigger automatic review at the DCI level. Everything about this booking demanded careful handling and strict adherence to protocol. Torres completed the property inventory and gestured toward the holding area, a secured corridor with 3 individual cells used for temporary detention. Christina walked ahead of him, her posture still upright despite the humiliation of processing, her professional instincts recognizing that documentation mattered more than protest. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion, its walls concrete block painted the same institutional beige as the booking room. A steel bench ran along one wall. A stainless toilet occupied the corner, and a security camera mounted near the ceiling tracked movement with automated recording. Christina sat on the bench, finally allowing her shoulders to relax fractionally, finally permitting the physical toll of the arrest to register in her body's stillness. She wasn't alone in holding. In the adjacent cell, separated by steel mesh that permitted conversation, sat another detainee, a Hispanic man in his late 20s, wearing work clothes that suggested construction or manual labor. His face showed the particular weariness of someone who'd been through this process before, who knew the rhythms of detention and the futility of demanding immediate answers. The man noticed Christina's arrival, took in her professional attire and visible wrist bruising, and offered a greeting pitched low enough to avoid attracting attention from deputies outside the holding corridor. He introduced himself as Marco Reyes, detained on charges of driving without proper documentation after being stopped on Highway 3 for allegedly failing to signal a lane change he'd definitely signaled. His tone carried bitter familiarity with pretextual stops, with violations manufactured to justify intervention, with the specific experience of being targeted for reasons unrelated to traffic safety. Christina listened as Marco detailed his encounter with Sullivan, the same aggressive approach, the same dismissal of explanations, the same escalation from minor violation to custody. Marco had been stopped 4 times in 3 years, he explained quietly, always by Sullivan, always on technical violations that somehow disappeared from official records but left him with towing fees and lost work hours. Other minority residents in Waverly had similar stories, shared in hushed conversations at community gatherings, but complaints to the department went nowhere because body cam footage mysteriously lacked audio, became corrupted, or simply wasn't preserved. The pattern crystallized as Marco spoke. Sullivan's targeting wasn't an isolated incident, but systematic practice, refined over years of impunity. The body cam audio disabling explained everything: why complaints failed to gain traction, why investigations found insufficient evidence, why Sullivan's conduct reports remained clean despite consistent accusations from non-white residents. Without audio, the footage showed only professional interaction, proper procedure, complaints that looked like post-arrest resentment rather than legitimate grievance. Christina absorbed the information with the analytical focus of someone whose career centered on prosecutorial patterns and evidence evaluation. Her legal mind cataloged each detailed dates, violation types, demographic consistency, building the framework of systemic discrimination that existed beyond individual anecdote. This wasn't one sheriff's bias expressed in isolated incident. This was institutional racism protected by technological manipulation, a scheme that had operated successfully because the evidence had been deliberately erased. Do you think body cams should always record audio without fail? Drop a yes or no in the comments and tell me why. I read and respond to every comment. Outside the holding area, Deputy Torres completed the booking documentation and made a decision that violated direct chain of command. Sullivan's orders had been explicit. Complete the intake, generate the arrest report, file the documentation without flagging it for supervisory review. Standard procedure for minor violations, nothing that required immediate notification of command staff. But Torres understood this booking was anything but standard, and proper protocol demanded escalation regardless of Sullivan's preferences. Torres picked up the processing desk phone and dialed the extension for Lieutenant Sarah Vance, night shift supervisor, currently in her office completing monthly statistics. The conversation was brief and professional. State attorney in custody, booked by Sullivan, visible injury documentation, charges inconsistent with evidence, immediate supervisory review recommended. Vance's response was, immediate secure all documentation, preserve all footage, prevent any evidence access by arresting officer. She'd be in processing within 3 minutes. Sullivan, standing near the Sallyport entrance, reviewing his arrest report on a tablet, noticed Torres on the phone and felt the first cold spike of unease penetrate his defensive certainty. He crossed to the processing desk with forced casualness, asking who Torres was contacting. Torres responded with professional detachment, supervisory notification, standard protocol for arrests of state officials, nothing unusual. Sullivan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, recognizing that intervention would create the exact appearance of impropriety he needed to avoid. Sullivan attempted to access the body cam footage through the evidence management system, standard practice for officers reviewing their own recordings before completing narrative reports. He logged into the computer terminal, navigated to his active recordings, and selected the timestamp range covering Christina's arrest. The system denied access locked footage, state-level administrative review required, local viewing permissions suspended pending DCI clearance. Sullivan stared at the error message for 5 seconds, his mind struggling to process what should have been impossible. Body cam footage was stored locally, accessible to recording officers for 48 hours before permanent archiving, a grace period designed to allow narrative report verification. But the error message indicated override at state level, protocols that superseded departmental control, restrictions that hadn't existed 3 months ago when he'd last reviewed his footage. The firmware update he'd never been briefed on. The state mandate he'd never read. The technological safeguard that had been implemented silently across Iowa's law enforcement infrastructure to combat exactly the kind of evidence tampering Sullivan had practiced for 4 years. Sullivan logged out of the terminal and walked quickly toward the station's rear exit, abandoning Christina's personal property still sitting in an evidence bag on the processing desk in his rush to reach his vehicle. He needed to think, to assess, to determine how much damage the body cam might have captured before he could implement containment. The audio should have been disabled, had always been disabled, had protected him through 73 previous encounters where his language and conduct had crossed professional boundaries. But the locked footage, the state-level override, the supervisor being notified, everything suggested the protective walls he'd built were crumbling. And Christina Elias, sitting and holding, represented not an isolated problem, but the first crack in a system that was about to collapse completely. In the holding cell, Christina sat with her back against concrete block, her wrists still aching from handcuffs that had been removed 20 minutes ago. She thought about her grandmother's house 2 blocks from where this had started, about the bread and milk still abandoned on Maple Street's sidewalk, about the simple family visit that had transformed into evidence of systematic abuse. The humiliation was real, the handcuffs, the booking photos, the cage she currently occupied. The powerlessness was real, her authority meaning nothing in the moment Sullivan had decided his bias mattered more than her identity. But underneath the humiliation, beneath the immediate indignity, Christina's professional instincts operated with perfect clarity. She understood evidence chains. She understood body cam protocols. She understood exactly how thoroughly Sullivan had just destroyed his own career by arresting someone who helped design the transparency systems, now documenting his misconduct. The night stretched ahead with bureaucratic slowness. Her release would come eventually. State attorneys weren't held overnight on parking violations, even ones escalated through false accusations. But the hours of detention mattered. Every moment in custody added weight to the evidence. Every procedural irregularity compounded the violations. Every instance of Sullivan's excessive force and racial animus crystallized into prosecutable misconduct. Christina closed her eyes and breathed deliberately through the discomfort. Her grandmother would worry, but would understand. The grocery delivery would wait. Justice, Christina had learned through years of prosecutorial work, operated on its own timeline, sometimes frustratingly slow, occasionally devastatingly swift. Tonight was the beginning of swift. She could feel it in the way Torres had photographed her injuries, in the supervisor being called, in the locked footage that Sullivan couldn't access. The technological karma of a firmware update he'd never known existed was about to become the witness that ended everything he built on silence and erased audio. Christina waited in holding with the patience of someone who understood that power wasn't always visible, that authority sometimes manifested in quiet documentation rather than immediate intervention, that justice for her would mean justice for the dozens of others Sullivan had targeted over 4 years of unchecked discrimination. The body cam footage uploaded through the night in encrypted packets, every frame preserved, every word captured, every moment of bias transformed into undeniable evidence, waiting for morning review and the inevitable investigation that would follow. The body cam footage completed its upload sequence at 11:47 p.m., the final data packets encrypting themselves into Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation servers located in Des Moines. The upload process operated automatically, triggered by Sullivan's cruiser connecting to the station's Wi-Fi network when he parked in the Sallyport. 41 minutes and 17 seconds of high-definition video paired with crystal-clear audio, all of it time-stamped, geotagged, and secured behind administrative protocols that prevented deletion below state oversight level. The footage joined 847 other recordings uploaded that evening across Iowa's 83 sheriff departments, all of them funneling into centralized storage where retention algorithms flagged potential issues for human review. The DCI employed 6 analysts dedicated to body cam review, working rotating shifts to screen footage within 72 hours of upload. Their mandate was straightforward: identify excessive force, procedural violations, civil rights infractions, or officer misconduct requiring investigation. At 6:23 a.m. Friday morning, DCI analyst Patricia Brennan began her shift by pulling the overnight queue, 312 flagged videos requiring priority review based on automated content scanning. The algorithms looked for specific markers: weapons drawn, use of force language, elevated stress indicators and vocal patterns, arrest of protected classes, detention exceeding standard timeframes. Sullivan's footage had triggered 4 separate flags: force language detected, minority subject custody, official credentials discovered during search, supervisor notification logged. Brennan opened the file with routine professional attention, expecting another standard use of force review that would likely clear with proper documentation. She began playback at normal speed, watching Sullivan approach Christina's vehicle on Maple Street, watching him activate emergency lights for a parking violation that the tape measure would show was legal within Iowa's 5-foot statute. By the 3-minute mark, Brennan had slowed playback and begun taking detailed notes. By the 7-minute mark, when Sullivan accused Christina of DUI without evidence, Brennan had flagged the case for immediate supervisory escalation. By the 17-minute mark, when Sullivan tightened the handcuffs with visible excessive force despite Christina's full compliance, Brennan had initiated a preliminary investigation file and began pulling Sullivan's employment record. The audio capture changed everything. Without audio, the footage would have shown a professional arrest with potentially questionable probable cause, but no clear civil rights violation. With audio with Sullivan's muttered slurs during transport, with his dismissive tone throughout the encounter, with his verbal justifications revealing bias rather than law enforcement necessity, the footage documented systematic racial targeting with evidentiary clarity that eliminated interpretation. Brennan contacted her supervisor, DCI Special Agent Mark Crawford, at 7:02 a.m. Crawford reviewed the footage personally, his expression hardening as he watched Sullivan's conduct unfold in documented detail. By 7:45 a.m., Crawford had initiated formal investigation protocols, assigned case number D-CI-2024-BR-047, and begun pulling metadata from all of Sullivan's previous body cam recordings stored in the state system. The metadata told its own damning story. Sullivan's body cam had recorded 284 encounters over the past 4 years. Of those recordings, 197 contained video-only files with corrupted or missing audio, despite the camera's technical specifications indicating functional audio capture. The audio failures weren't random, they clustered specifically around traffic stops involving minority subjects, demographic patterns so consistent they eliminated equipment malfunction as plausible explanation. Crawford's forensic IT specialist, a civilian contractor named David Rourke, analyzed the technical specifications of Sullivan's camera unit and compared them against the video files. The analysis revealed systematic audio disabling through settings menu manipulation, a feature that had existed in the department's outdated firmware until Iowa's mandatory update 3 months earlier. The update had eliminated local audio control and activated tamper-resistant continuous recording. But Sullivan had never been briefed on the change, because Bremer County's IT infrastructure operated on minimal staffing and assumed officers would adapt to new systems without formal training. The firmware update had activated on Sullivan's camera on the 15th of September 2024, 6 weeks before Christina's arrest. Every recording since that date contained full audio capture, though Sullivan had continued to operate under the assumption that his routine audio disabling still functioned. The technological karma was perfect. The very system Sullivan had manipulated for years had been silently repaired, and his continued misconduct had been captured with pristine clarity because he believed himself protected by tampering that no longer worked. By 9:30 a.m., Crawford had compiled preliminary findings sufficient for immediate escalation. He contacted Iowa Attorney General Rachel Morrison's office and requested urgent meeting regarding officer misconduct investigation with potential civil rights implications and evidence of systematic discrimination. Morrison's chief of staff scheduled the meeting for 11 a.m. that same morning, recognizing from Crawford's tone that the matter demanded immediate attention. While the investigation machinery activated in Des Moines, Christina Elias had been released from Bremer County, holding at 2:47 a.m. on her own recognizance. The release had come without explanation, beyond standard procedure for nonviolent misdemeanors processed by night shift deputy who seemed professionally uncomfortable with the entire situation. Christina had signed property receipts, retrieved her belongings, minus her vehicle which remained on Maple Street, and accepted a ride from Deputy Torres who'd volunteered to transport her back to Waverly during his meal break. Torres had driven in silence for the first 3 miles before speaking quietly that the footage had been preserved, that supervisors were involved, that documentation existed beyond Sullivan's control. Christina had thanked him with simple acknowledgement, recognizing the professional risk Torres had taken by defying Sullivan's implicit orders. Some forms of courage manifested in small acts of proper procedure rather than dramatic confrontation. Christina arrived at her grandmother's house at 3:15 a.m., entering through the spare key hidden in the porch planter, finding Evelyn Cooper asleep in her recliner with the television still playing. Christina had covered her grandmother with the crocheted afghan from the couch, turned off the television, and spent the remaining pre-dawn hours sitting at the kitchen table, documenting everything she remembered about the arrest. Her legal training demanded precision. She recorded times, locations, exact phrases Sullivan had used, the progression of escalation, the handcuff tightness, Torres's quiet documentation, Marco Reyes's testimony about Sullivan's pattern. She photographed her wrists in the kitchen's fluorescent light, capturing bruising that had deepened overnight into purple-black impressions shaped like handcuff curves. She typed her observations into her laptop with methodical attention to detail, creating a victim statement that would eventually join the DCI investigation file as primary testimony from a source with unimpeachable credibility. By 8 a.m. Friday morning, when Evelyn Cooper woke to find her granddaughter asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by documentation, Christina had completed a 19-page preliminary report detailing not only her own arrest, but the systemic patterns Marco's testimony had revealed. The report would become foundation for the investigation that was already underway, though Christina didn't yet know that DCI analysts were simultaneously reviewing the same body cam footage she'd spent hours describing from memory. At 10:47 a.m., Christina's phone rang with a call from Attorney General Morrison's direct office line. Morrison explained briefly that DCI had flagged footage from Christina's arrest, that preliminary investigation had begun, that her testimony would be required, and that the matter had escalated to state-level oversight effective immediately. Morrison's tone carried professional outrage, carefully controlled the arrest of her own state attorney by a county sheriff represented not just misconduct, but institutional failure requiring comprehensive response. Christina confirmed her availability for immediate meeting and agreed to drive to Des Moines that afternoon. Before ending the call, Morrison asked one question. Was Christina aware of any other victims, any pattern beyond this single incident? Christina's response was immediate, yes. At least one other detainee had described similar targeting, and given the demographic consistency suggested by his testimony, there were likely dozens more. Morrison's silence lasted 3 seconds before she promised comprehensive investigation and thanked Christina for her professionalism under circumstances that should never have occurred. Sullivan received his own phone call at 11:04 a.m., though from substantially different source. Lieutenant Vance informed him that DCI had requested all his body cam footage for review, that he was placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending investigation outcome, that his duty weapon and badge would be surrendered before end of shift, and that he was to have no contact with evidence or witnesses related to any arrests conducted in the past 6 months. Sullivan's protests went nowhere. Vance's tone remained professional but absolutely final. This was coming from state level, beyond departmental discretion, non-negotiable. Sullivan hung up the phone in his personal vehicle, parked outside a convenience store where he'd stopped for coffee during what should have been routine patrol shift. His hands shook slightly as he processed the reality crystallizing around him. The body cam footage existed, the audio existed. Christina Elias had the authority to pursue investigation with resources he couldn't match. The firmware update he'd never known about had eliminated his protective mechanism and left him exposed with documentation he couldn't erase or explain away. Sullivan's mind cycled through the 911 welfare check that had set everything in motion, the routine call that had positioned him on Birch Avenue, that had led to his route through Maple Street, that had put Christina's vehicle in his line of sight at exactly the moment his bias transformed perception into action. The cruel irony wasn't lost even in his mounting panic. A call to check on elderly welfare had led directly to his own career's destruction. By 1 p.m. Friday afternoon, DCI had compiled enough preliminary evidence to brief Attorney General Morrison comprehensively. The briefing lasted 90 minutes and included video playback, metadata analysis, demographic breakdowns of Sullivan's arrests over 4 years, and Christina's detailed victim statement. Morrison watched Sullivan's body cam footage in complete silence, her expression hardening as the encounter progressed from questionable stop through false accusation to excessive force and prejudiced commentary. Morrison's decision came immediately after the footage ended. Full investigation with unlimited resources, comprehensive review of all Sullivan's cases involving minority subjects, victim outreach to identify anyone else subjected to similar targeting, forensic analysis of all body cam evidence to document the audio tampering pattern, and coordination with Federal Civil Rights Division if the evidence supported federal charges. The investigation would be swift, thorough, and public. Transparency demanded it. Justice required it. And the technological evidence, the firmware update that had caught Sullivan in his own manipulated system, provided prosecutorial clarity that eliminated ambiguity. By 3 p.m., DCI agents were pulling case files, contacting previous arrestees, and preparing search warrants for Sullivan's office and personal devices. The machinery of accountability had activated with institutional weight, and Russell Sullivan's 16 years of unchecked authority were collapsing under the accumulated evidence of his own documented misconduct. The body cam footage sat in secured digital storage, every frame preserved, every word captured, waiting to be presented as the undeniable witness that would expose everything Sullivan had built on silence and erased audio. The DCI investigation expanded with methodical intensity over the following 72 hours. Special Agent Crawford assembled a task force of 8 investigators, 2 forensic IT specialists, and a victim services coordinator whose sole responsibility was contacting individuals who'd been arrested by Sullivan in the past 4 years. The case file expanded exponentially as each thread of inquiry uncovered additional evidence of systematic targeting hidden beneath professionally documented procedure. David Rourke, the forensic IT specialist, provided the technical foundation that transformed Christina's arrest from isolated incident into provable pattern. Rourke analyzed Sullivan's body cam hardware, extracted firmware version histories, and documented exactly when and how Sullivan had manipulated audio settings across 197 encounters. The analysis revealed sophisticated understanding of the camera system's backdoor controls. Sullivan hadn't simply disabled recording, but had accessed hidden settings menus designed for IT maintenance, toggling audio capture to standby mode while maintaining active video recording. The manipulation left digital fingerprints in the camera's event logs. Each settings change created time-stamped metadata entries that Sullivan had assumed were invisible or irrelevant. Rourke extracted these logs and correlated them with arrest records, creating a timeline that showed Sullivan disabling audio immediately before approaching minority subjects and reactivating it only after suspects were secured in custody or released. The pattern was too consistent for coincidence, too deliberate for equipment failure. The mid-story twist emerged in Rourke's firmware analysis. Iowa's mandatory update on the 15th of September 2024 hadn't simply locked audio controls, it had quietly logged every attempt to access the disabled settings menus. Sullivan had tried to disable audio during Christina's arrest, accessing the settings screen out of habit, but the firmware had blocked the attempt and recorded the failed access in an encrypted log file that uploaded alongside the footage. The log showed Sullivan's repeated attempts to manipulate audio during the initial approach, during transport, and during booking 14 separate failed attempts to disable the evidence that was actively documenting his misconduct. The technological karma was absolute. Sullivan's own attempts to hide evidence had created additional proof of his intent to tamper, transforming the arrest from biased conduct into conscious evidence manipulation. Federal obstruction of justice statutes suddenly became relevant. Victim outreach produced results that exceeded even Crawford's experienced expectations. The Victim Services Coordinator, working from demographic analysis of Sullivan's arrest records, contacted 43 individuals who met the profile: minority drivers, traffic violations that were technically dismissible, arrests where audio mysteriously failed. Of those 43, 31 agreed to provide statements. Of those 31, 27 described encounters nearly identical to Christina's experience: pretextual stops, escalated confrontations, excessive force, and professional reports that documented technical compliance while omitting the racial animus that had driven the interaction. The statements revealed systematic targeting across demographic lines. Black drivers comprised 68% of Sullivan's audio-disabled arrests, despite representing only 3% of Bremer County's population. Hispanic drivers comprised 24%, despite 4% population representation. The statistical disparity was so pronounced, it eliminated any possibility of random distribution or officer discretion exercised without bias. Marco Reyes' statement proved particularly valuable. He provided dates, times, and specific details of 4 separate stops by Sullivan over 3 years each, involving fabricated violations, each resulting in vehicle searches that found nothing illegal, each costing him towing fees and lost work hours. Marco had filed complaints after the second and third stops, but without audio evidence to contradict Sullivan's professional reports. The investigations had concluded with findings of proper procedure and unfounded grievance. Now, with firmware logs proving Sullivan had actively disabled audio during Marco's arrests, those complaints transformed from dismissed grievances into corroborated evidence of civil rights violations. The DCI reopened every complaint ever filed against Sullivan 17 in total over 16 years and began re-examining them through the lens of documented audio tampering. Christina coordinated with Attorney General Morrison while maintaining her professional role as state attorney. The dual position created unique prosecutorial dynamics. She was simultaneously victim and oversight authority, her testimony carrying weight beyond typical civilian witness, while her position demanded careful attention to conflicts of interest. Morrison handled this by assigning prosecutorial authority for Sullivan's case to a special prosecutor from outside Iowa's state attorney structure, eliminating any appearance of personal vendetta while preserving Christina's role in systemic reform discussions. Christina provided detailed testimony across 2 days of interviews, her legal training allowing her to articulate not just what Sullivan had done, but why each action constituted specific violations of law, procedure, and civil rights protections. Her statement included precise citations of Iowa Code sections Sullivan had violated, body cam statutes he'd subverted, and use of force protocols he'd exceeded. The statement read less like victim impact and more like prosecutorial brief, each claim supported by legal framework and evidentiary standard. Have you ever witnessed unfair treatment like this? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like and share this video to spread awareness. Sullivan's internal scrutiny intensified as evidence mounted. Lieutenant Vance conducted administrative review of his case files, pulling reports from arrests where audio had failed and comparing them against arrestee statements DCI was collecting. The comparison revealed systematic discrepancies. Sullivan's reports documented professional conduct and legitimate probable cause, while arrestee statements described racial slurs, manufactured violations, and force exceeding resistance levels. Without audio, the reports had been credited. With audio from similar encounters now available, the report's credibility collapsed. DCI prepared search warrants for Sullivan's office and home, seeking any evidence of coordination with other officers, documentation of his audio tampering methodology, or communications revealing consciousness of guilt. The warrants were executed simultaneously on Monday morning, 78 hours after Christina's arrest, with teams of agents descending on both locations, before Sullivan could prepare or destroy evidence. Sullivan's office at Bremer County Station yielded a desktop computer with deleted browser history, showing extensive research into bodycam firmware vulnerabilities and methods for disabling audio capture without triggering system warnings. IT forensics recovered the deleted files and documented Sullivan's self-education in evidence tampering searches spanning 18 months. Forum posts where he'd asked questions about camera systems under anonymous usernames, and bookmarked articles about officers in other states who'd successfully manipulated their recording equipment. His home yielded less technical evidence, but more damning personal documentation. A personal journal containing entries that revealed conscious awareness of his targeting patterns, rationalized through racist ideology and frustration with what he termed professional courtesy expectations for minorities. The entries didn't constitute confession, but demonstrated state of mind. Sullivan knew he was treating minority drivers differently, believed he was justified in doing so, and had consciously constructed protective mechanisms to avoid accountability. The forensic evidence eliminated any defense based on claims of unintentional bias or equipment misunderstanding. Sullivan had deliberately researched tampering methods, deliberately disabled audio across nearly 200 encounters, and deliberately constructed reports that omitted his discriminatory conduct. The pattern spanned 4 years, touched dozens of victims, and demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic civil rights violations that federal oversight was designed to prosecute. Attorney General Morrison reviewed the compiled evidence on Tuesday evening and made immediate decision regarding prosecution strategy. The case wouldn't go to trial, not because evidence was insufficient, but because evidence was overwhelming. Morrison would seek administrative sanctions through law enforcement decertification proceedings rather than criminal prosecution, a faster mechanism that would permanently remove Sullivan from police work while leaving open possibility of federal civil rights charges if Department of Justice chose to intervene. The decertification strategy served multiple purposes. It avoided lengthy criminal trial that might get mired in procedural disputes over evidence admissibility or jury selection challenges in a predominantly white county. It created immediate accountability through administrative process that law enforcement officers understood and accepted as legitimate. And it preserved prosecutorial resources for the systematic reforms Morrison intended to implement across Iowa's law enforcement infrastructure. The technological karma of the firmware update had eliminated Sullivan's protective mechanism, but institutional response would determine whether his exposure created lasting change or remained isolated punishment. Morrison intended lasting change. The Elias case, as it was being termed internally, represented opportunity to reform body cam protocols, strengthen transparency requirements, and establish precedent that evidence tampering by law enforcement would trigger career-ending consequences regardless of local department protection. By Wednesday afternoon, DCI had compiled 847 pages of evidence, documentation, interview transcripts from 31 victims, forensic reports proving Sullivan's tampering methodology, and demographic analysis showing systematic racial targeting. The evidence package was sufficient for immediate administrative charges and permanent decertification. Morrison scheduled a press conference for Thursday morning, 10 days after Christina's arrest. The timing was deliberate fast enough to demonstrate institutional responsiveness, but slow enough to ensure comprehensive evidence compilation that would withstand scrutiny. Morrison's communications staff prepared press materials that balanced transparency with appropriate legal caution, emphasizing the investigation's findings without prejudicing any subsequent federal proceedings. Sullivan, confined to his home under administrative leave, watched his career disintegrate through phone calls from attorneys he consulted and couldn't afford, from colleagues who'd once been friendly but now avoided contact, from family members who struggled to reconcile the professional sheriff they'd known with the systematic racist the evidence portrayed. His welfare check distraction had become cosmic irony. The routine call to protect vulnerable residents had positioned him to destroy his own career by targeting a woman whose authority he'd catastrophically underestimated. The firmware update that Sullivan never knew existed, that had activated silently 6 weeks before Christina's arrest, that had captured every word of his unfiltered racism and preserved it beyond his control. This technological safeguard had accomplished what years of complaints and investigations had failed to achieve. Sullivan's manipulation had been defeated not by human oversight but by administrative code that prevented the exact tampering he'd relied upon. Justice. Christina reflected from her office in Des Moines, where she'd returned to work while the investigation proceeded, sometimes manifested through unexpected mechanisms. Not dramatic courtroom confrontation or investigative journalism expose, but through firmware updates and retention protocols and transparency requirements that operated silently until the moment they mattered absolutely. The Attorney General's decision on immediate administrative action represented the inflection point, the moment Sullivan's unchecked authority would transform into public accountability, the moment victims would receive acknowledgement, and the moment Iowa's law enforcement would confront the reality that technological safeguards had eliminated the protective silence that had enabled abuse. Thursday's press conference would make everything public. The exposure would be complete, and the technological karma that had trapped Sullivan in his own manipulated system would become the catalyst for reforms that extended far beyond one sheriff's downfall. The Iowa State Capitol's press room filled beyond capacity by 9:30 a.m. Thursday morning, 45 minutes before Attorney General Morrison's scheduled conference. Local television stations occupied the front rows, their cameras positioned for optimal angles on the podium where the state seal hung as backdrop. Regional print journalists crowded the middle section, notebooks ready, recorders activated. National outlets had sent correspondence after Morrison's office released preliminary details Wednesday evening, a state attorney wrongfully arrested by county sheriff, body cam evidence showing racial bias, systematic targeting spanning 4 years, technological evidence of tampering. The story had every element of institutional failure that captured national attention. Morrison entered at 10:15 a.m., accompanied by DCI Special Agent Crawford and Christina Elias. Morrison wore the professional severity that marked significant announcements, dark suit, minimal jewelry, expression that communicated controlled outrage at misconduct that had occurred under her oversight. Crawford carried a tablet containing the presentation materials, redacted excerpts from Sullivan's body cam footage, forensic findings, demographic analyses. Christina's presence was strategic victim and authority simultaneously, her state attorney position adding weight to the accusations, while her composure demonstrated professionalism under circumstances that would have justified anger. Morrison's opening statement lasted 7 minutes and contained no procedural softening. She detailed Sullivan's arrest of Christina without legal justification, his false DUI accusation, his excessive force during handcuffing, and his transport to custody, accompanied by racial slurs captured on body cam audio he believed was disabled. Morrison played 2 minutes of footage, enough to show Sullivan's approach, Christina's calm explanation of Iowa's parking statute, Sullivan's dismissal of legal facts, and the escalation that followed. The audio quality was pristine, Sullivan's bias undeniable. The press room remained silent during playback, except for the footage's sound Sullivan's voice, sharp with confrontation, demanding compliance from a woman who'd committed no violation. Christina's voice, measured and professional, citing precise statutes. Sullivan's muttered commentary during transport, captured so clearly the microphone's quality, became its own evidence. Morrison paused after the footage ended, allowing the implications to settle, then continued with findings that expanded the incident from individual misconduct to systematic abuse. The body cam forensic analysis proved Sullivan had disabled audio during 197 encounters over 4 years, with targeting patterns showing gross statistical disparity in arrests of minority drivers. The firmware update implemented 3 months earlier had reactivated full recording without Sullivan's knowledge, capturing his misconduct in undeniable detail and creating evidence trail that documented his tampering attempts. Crawford presented the demographic data on large screens visible throughout the press room. Black drivers, 68% of Sullivan's audio-disabled arrests, 3% of county population. Hispanic drivers, 24% of arrests, 4% of population. The numbers eliminated ambiguity. Sullivan hadn't simply been biased, he'd been systematically targeting minorities while creating evidentiary void that protected him from accountability. Morrison announced Sullivan's immediate suspension without pay pending decertification proceedings scheduled for the following week. She emphasized that criminal prosecution remained possible pending federal civil rights review, but that administrative removal from law enforcement represented the fastest path to permanent accountability. Morrison also announced comprehensive review of all Bremer County Sheriff's Department practices, mandatory body cam training across Iowa's law enforcement agencies, and firmware audits to ensure the technological safeguards that had caught Sullivan were functioning statewide. Then Christina delivered her statement, and the press conference shifted from institutional announcement to personal testimony that carried both vulnerability and authority. She stood at the podium without notes, her hands resting calmly on its surface despite the cameras, her voice carrying the controlled emotion of someone who'd processed trauma through professional discipline but wouldn't minimize its impact. Christina described the afternoon she'd driven to visit her grandmother carrying bread and milk, the parking space she'd carefully measured to ensure compliance with Iowa's 5-foot statute, the moment Sullivan's emergency lights had activated behind her legally parked vehicle. She detailed his dismissal of legal explanation, his baseless DUI accusation, his handcuffs tightened to cause injury despite her complete compliance. She described the humiliation of detention, the processing, the holding cell where she'd encountered another of Sullivan's victims. Her voice remained steady throughout, but the content carried emotional weight that professional delivery couldn't neutralize. She'd been arrested while visiting her grandmother, handcuffed for parking legally, accused of crimes she hadn't committed, detained because a sheriff's bias had mattered more than his oath. Then, Christina's testimony pivoted from personal experience to systematic analysis. As state attorney, she explained, her role included oversight of transparency protocols designed to prevent exactly the misconduct Sullivan had practiced. The body cam retention statute that captured Sullivan's crimes was legislation she'd helped refine. The firmware update that eliminated his audio tampering had been implemented based on recommendations from investigations her office had supported. The technological karma wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, policy designed to create evidentiary protection that survived individual officers' attempts at manipulation. Christina's statement concluded with acknowledgement of privilege her position had given her resources and credibility that Sullivan's other victims lacked. Minority drivers without legal expertise, without professional authority, without connections to oversight mechanisms, had experienced the same targeting but had seen their complaints dismissed because audio evidence didn't exist to corroborate their testimony. Her arrest had exposed a system that had operated successfully for 4 years because Sullivan had controlled the evidence. Reform required ensuring that body cam integrity protected all victims, not just those who happened to hold positions of power. The press room erupted with questions as Christina stepped back from the podium. Morrison fielded them with practiced efficiency, confirming victim count currently stood at 31 with statements and likely extended beyond those who'd already come forward. Yes, victims would receive formal apologies in case reviews. Yes, wrongful convictions would be overturned. Yes, Sullivan faced potential federal charges if Department of Justice determined civil rights violations warranted prosecution beyond state administrative sanctions. While Morrison conducted the press conference, DCI agents executed the simultaneous raid on Sullivan's office that had been precisely coordinated for 10:15 a.m. The timing was deliberate, media attention focused on the Capitol, while evidence seizure proceeded without spectacle. 6 agents entered Bremer County Station with search warrants authorizing comprehensive documentation seizure, case files, body cam equipment, Sullivan's desktop computer, personal items from his locker, any evidence related to arrests conducted in the past 6 years. Lieutenant Vance had prepared the department for the raid, instructing staff to cooperate fully and provide unrestricted access. The raid proceeded with professional efficiency agents photographed Sullivan's workspace, imaged his computer's hard drive, inventoried case files that showed patterns of dismissed complaints and minimized incident reports, collected body cam equipment showing firmware version histories that documented when audio disabling had functioned and when it had been eliminated. The evidence filled 11 boxes that were transported to DCI headquarters in Des Moines for cataloging and analysis. Each box represented another layer of Sullivan's systematic misconduct, manipulated reports, targeted enforcement, complaints that had been professionally documented but bureaucratically buried. The scope exceeded what any individual complaint could have revealed. Only comprehensive review uncovered the full pattern. Sullivan watched Morrison's press conference from his living room, his career crumbling in high definition on 3 separate channels broadcasting the event live. His phone remained silent, colleagues avoiding contact, attorneys declining representation once they reviewed the evidence package DCI had provided, family members who'd called earlier but had nothing left to say. The professional isolation was complete. The footage played across every channel, his voice carrying clear racial bias, his actions documented beyond dispute. Morrison's presentation of demographic data made his targeting undeniable. Christina's testimony humanized the statistics while her position emphasized the systematic nature of abuse that had operated under appearance of professional conduct. Sullivan's welfare check, called a routine intervention that had positioned him to destroy his own career, now appeared across news coverage as ironic footnote. Sheriff, responding to protect vulnerable elderly, had instead violated constitutional rights of woman visiting her grandmother. The cosmic justice of that particular detail wasn't lost on commentators parsing the story's elements. Media coverage expanded rapidly throughout Thursday. Local stations emphasized Christina's Iowa State Attorney position and Sullivan's 16-year career. Regional coverage focused on the body cam firmware update as technological solution to evidence tampering problem that had plagued police accountability for years. National outlets highlighted the systematic targeting and statistical disparities, showing institutional racism disguised as professional discretion. Social media response divided along predictable lines, some defending Sullivan as victim of political correctness, others celebrating his exposure as example of accountability, finally reaching abusive officers. Christina's professional credentials complicated typical narratives about police victims lacking credibility. Sullivan had arrested someone with unimpeachable authority, someone who helped design the very transparency systems documenting his crimes, someone whose legal expertise made her ideal witness to his misconduct. The irony satisfied those who sought poetic justice. Victims began contacting DCI throughout Thursday afternoon as media coverage spread. Individuals who'd been stopped by Sullivan years earlier, who'd accepted citations rather than fight technical violations, who'd assumed their complaints went nowhere because they lacked proof. These individuals saw the press conference and recognized their experiences in Christina's testimony. The victim count climbed from 31 to 47 by end of business Thursday, each new statement adding detail to the systematic pattern. Bremer County Board of Supervisors held emergency meeting Thursday evening to address the department crisis. The discussion focused on liability, potential civil lawsuits from victims whose constitutional rights had been violated, settlement costs that would burden county budget, insurance coverage questions given that Sullivan's misconduct had been deliberate rather than negligent. The board voted unanimously to cooperate fully with DCI investigation and to implement immediate reforms, including independent body cam auditing and mandatory bias training. Morrison's office prepared victim services protocols for Friday morning formal apology letters, case review procedures, compensation discussions for individuals who'd paid fines for violations that had been pretextual. The logistics were complex, but the mandate was clear. Victims deserved acknowledgement, remedy, and assurance that Sullivan's pattern had been permanently stopped. Christina returned to her grandmother's house Thursday evening, the first opportunity she'd had to properly explain the arrest that had disrupted her grocery delivery 10 days earlier. Evelyn Cooper had watched the press conference, had seen her granddaughter testify with professional composure about humiliation and injustice, had understood finally why Christina had arrived at 3:15 a.m. with handcuff bruises and documentation obsession. They sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where Christina had typed her 19-page preliminary report, drinking tea while October darkness settled outside windows that faced toward Maple Street where the faded fire hydrant still stood witness. Evelyn expressed quiet pride in her granddaughter's resilience, tempered with anger that such resilience had been necessary. Christina emphasized that her experience mattered primarily because it had exposed systematic abuse affecting dozens of others who lacked her resources to demand accountability. The conversation turned to legacy, what changes might result from this particular injustice being documented so thoroughly that institutional response became inevitable. Christina believed the firmware update represented the key lesson. Technological safeguards, properly implemented, could overcome human manipulation. Body cam integrity wasn't about trusting officers, but about creating systems that preserve truth regardless of individual officers' preferences. Sullivan had been caught not because oversight worked, but because technology eventually prevented tampering he'd relied upon for years. The department scheduled Sullivan's decertification hearing for the following Thursday, 7 days after the press conference, allowing time for victims to provide additional testimony, but moving quickly enough to demonstrate institutional commitment to accountability. The hearing would be public, live-streamed, conducted with formal procedural requirements that protected Sullivan's due process rights while allowing comprehensive presentation of evidence against him. The poetic justice of transparency laws Morrison had mentioned during the press conference was becoming manifest. Sullivan had been protected by opacity, disabled audio, dismissed complaints, reports that documented technical compliance while omitting discriminatory conduct. His exposure resulted from transparency mechanisms, mandatory body cam retention, firmware integrity, administrative protocols that prevented evidence deletion. The systems designed to protect truth had finally overcome the manipulation that had protected abuse. By Friday morning, media coverage had reached saturation. Sullivan's story appeared across major national outlets as example of both police accountability failure and technological solution that eventually worked. Christina's unique dual role as victim and oversight authority provided narrative hook that elevated the story beyond typical police misconduct coverage. The firmware update that had caught Sullivan became technological detail that satisfied audiences seeking evidence that problems could be solved through better systems rather than relying only on individual officer integrity. Victims' cases began formal review Friday afternoon, with prosecutors examining each arrest Sullivan had conducted where audio had been disabled and demographic targeting was indicated. The review would take months, but initial analysis suggested at least 37 cases warranted immediate dismissal based on probable cause problems now evident through Sullivan's documented pattern. Convictions would be overturned, records expunged, formal apologies issued to individuals who'd been processed through criminal justice system based on stops that had been racially motivated rather than law enforcement necessity. Sullivan faced the weekend alone in his home, career ended, reputation destroyed, facing potential federal prosecution and certain civil lawsuits from victims he'd targeted over 4 years of unchecked authority. The welfare check call that had positioned him to arrest Christina, that routine intervention meant to protect vulnerable residents, had become the mechanism of his own destruction. The cosmic irony offered no comfort. The technological karma of a firmware update he'd never known existed had transformed his protective manipulation into documented proof of systematic misconduct he couldn't explain or minimize. The press conference had accomplished Morrison's strategic objectives: public accountability, victim acknowledgement, institutional commitment to reform, and warning to other officers who might be manipulating evidence that technological safeguards now prevented the tampering Sullivan had practiced. The hearing scheduled for following Thursday would complete the administrative process, permanently removing Sullivan from law enforcement and establishing precedent that evidence tampering triggered career-ending consequences. Christina reflected from her Des Moines office Friday evening that justice had manifested through unexpected combination of her individual authority and systematic protections that existed independent of her position. The firmware update would have eventually caught Sullivan even if he'd targeted someone without her credentials. But her state attorney role had accelerated investigation, ensured comprehensive review, and created political will for reforms that might otherwise have been delayed. Her humiliation had been real. Her authority had made it consequential beyond individual remedy. The poetic justice of transparency laws beginning to manifest, as Morrison had described, lay in the fact that light eventually overcame darkness when systems were properly designed. Sullivan's manipulation had worked until it didn't. The technology had been defeated until it wasn't. The victims had lacked proof until suddenly proof existed beyond dispute. The body cam footage sat in secured storage, having been viewed millions of times across news broadcasts and social media. Its crystal clear audio and timestamp evidence having demolished Sullivan's career and validated every complaint that had been dismissed for lack of corroboration. The firmware update that Sullivan never knew existed had become the witness that ended everything he built on silence and erased audio. Thursday's hearing would formalize what Friday's reality had already established. Russell Sullivan's career in law enforcement was over, his systematic racism was documented beyond dispute, and the transparency systems designed to protect truth had finally functioned exactly as intended. The Iowa Law Enforcement Academy decertification hearing convened Thursday morning in a conference room designed to accommodate 20 participants, but now packed with 47 attendees, overflow spectators, and media representatives confined to designated observation area. The proceeding operated under administrative law rather than criminal trial standards, lower burden of proof, relaxed evidence rules, panel of 5 law enforcement oversight board members serving as judges and jury combined. Sullivan sat at the respondent's table with his attorney, a Des Moines defense lawyer named Richard Klein, who'd agreed to representation more from professional obligation than conviction in his client's defense. Klein had reviewed the evidence package, 847 pages, 31 victim statements, body cam footage with pristine audio, forensic IT analysis proving systematic tampering, and had advised Sullivan that fighting decertification was futile. The hearing would proceed as formality, the outcome predetermined by evidence that eliminated reasonable dispute. The panel consisted of 3 active law enforcement administrators from counties outside Bremer's jurisdiction, 1 retired federal law enforcement officer, and 1 civilian attorney specializing in police accountability. Their role was determining whether Sullivan's conduct violated professional standards sufficient to warrant permanent credential revocation. The standard wasn't criminal guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but professional competence measured against basic fitness to serve in law enforcement capacity. DCI Special Agent Crawford presented the state's case with methodical precision. He began with Christina's arrest, playing the full 41 minutes of body cam footage without commentary, allowing Sullivan's own words and actions to establish the pattern of misconduct. The footage played on large screens visible throughout the hearing room, its audio quality eliminating any ambiguity about Sullivan's racial bias, false accusations, and excessive force. The panel watched in silence. Sullivan stared at the table, his jaw clenched, refusing to watch himself destroy his own career in high-definition playback. Christina sat in the witness gallery, her expression carefully neutral, watching the panel's reactions rather than the footage she'd experienced firsthand. Crawford followed the video with forensic IT testimony from David Rourke, who explained the body cam's technical specifications, the firmware version history showing when audio control had existed and when it had been eliminated, and the encrypted logs proving Sullivan had attempted to disable audio 14 times during Christina's arrest. Rourke's testimony established that Sullivan's tampering hadn't been an isolated mistake, but practiced technique he'd applied across nearly 200 encounters over 4 years. Then came the victim testimony, not all 31 individuals who provided statements, but representative sample designed to show patterns consistency. Marco Reyes described as 4 stops by Sullivan over 3 years, each involving fabricated violations, each resulting in searches that found nothing, each costing him financially and professionally. An elderly black man named Thomas Wright testified about being stopped for suspicious driving while returning from church on a Sunday afternoon, detained for an hour while Sullivan searched his vehicle for drugs that didn't exist. A young Hispanic woman named Sofia Alvarez described being pulled over for failing to signal a turn she'd definitely signaled, then subjected to field sobriety tests. She passed before being released with warning and apology that felt more like threat than courtesy. The testimony continued through Thursday morning, each story similar in structure, each revealing Sullivan's systematic targeting, each explaining why complaints had gone nowhere when audio evidence didn't exist to corroborate testimony. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Sullivan hadn't simply been occasionally biased, but had operated a deliberate scheme of racial targeting, protected by evidence manipulation he believed was undetectable. Klein mounted minimal defense during cross-examination. limiting himself to establishing that none of the witnesses had been physically injured beyond brief detention and that Sullivan's reports had documented technical legal justifications for each stop. The defense satisfied professional obligation without attempting to overcome evidence that couldn't be disputed. Klein understood his role was ensuring procedural fairness rather than securing acquittal that wasn't possible. Sullivan testified briefly Thursday afternoon, his statement lasting 14 minutes and consisting primarily of acknowledgement that his conduct had failed professional standards, that his targeting of minority drivers showed bias he was working to understand, and that he accepted responsibility for evidence tampering while minimizing its deliberate nature as improper procedure, rather than intentional civil rights violations. The testimony was calculated to demonstrate remorse without admitting criminality that could be used in federal prosecution or civil lawsuits. Sullivan's tone carried the particular quality of someone reading scripted apology written by an attorney who knew authentic contrition would be challenged. The panel's expressions suggested they recognized performance art rather than genuine accountability. Crawford presented final evidence Thursday afternoon that eliminated any residual sympathy Sullivan's testimony might have generated. The personal journal entries recovered from Sullivan's home-dated entries showing conscious awareness of his targeting, racist rationalization of his conduct, and explicit discussion of audio disabling as protective mechanism against complaints he knew were legitimate. The journal entries weren't confession, but they demonstrated mens rea, guilty mind, criminal intent, conscious knowledge that his conduct violated standards he was sworn to uphold. The panel deliberated for 43 minutes, shorter than most observers expected, suggesting consensus formed quickly around evidence that permitted only one outcome. They returned with findings that Sullivan had violated professional standards in categories spanning constitutional rights infringement, evidence tampering, discriminatory enforcement, excessive force, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Each violation alone warranted decertification. Collectively, they demonstrated unfitness for law enforcement service so comprehensive that rehabilitation wasn't plausible consideration. The sanctions came swiftly. Permanent decertification preventing Sullivan from serving in any law enforcement capacity in Iowa or reciprocal states. $47,000 fine representing restitution for costs of investigation and victim services. Mandatory bias training completion, though the requirement was largely symbolic, given he'd never work in policing again. And public apology, to be delivered formally to Bremer County residents, and specifically to Christina Elias and other named victims. The panel chair, a career law enforcement administrator named Douglas Vernon, who'd served 32 years before retirement, delivered closing statement that emphasized the decision's institutional significance. Vernon acknowledged that body cam tampering represented betrayal of transparency principles law enforcement had fought to establish, that Sullivan's systematic racism damaged public trust beyond his individual misconduct, and that technological safeguards like the firmware update represented necessary protection when officer discretion couldn't be trusted to self-regulate. Vernon's statement concluded with direct address to Sullivan. The badge carried sacred obligation to serve all citizens equally, regardless of race or status, and Sullivan's deliberate violation of that obligation represented failure so fundamental it left no option except permanent removal. Law enforcement demanded better. Citizens deserved better. And Sullivan's career was finished not because of single mistake, but because of 4-year pattern showing character fundamentally incompatible with authority he'd been granted. Sullivan left the hearing room immediately after sanctions were announced, avoiding media congregated outside and declining to provide statement. His attorney read brief prepared remarks, acknowledging the panel's decision and expressing hope that reforms would prevent similar misconduct by other officers. The statement satisfied media's need for official response without creating additional legal exposure. Christina overseen a mandatory bias training session Thursday evening that Sullivan was required to complete as condition of his sanction despite his permanent decertification. The training operated as exercise in humiliation more than education. Sullivan, sitting in classroom with 18 other officers who'd been flagged for bias concerns, none with misconduct approaching his level, all of them aware of his case from media coverage. Christina conducted the session without identifying herself. maintaining professional anonymity while presenting hypothetical scenarios that mirrored Sullivan's actual conduct. The scenarios asked officers to identify bias indicators, procedural violations, and decision points where escalation could have been avoided. Sullivan participated minimally, his responses terse and defensive, his body language communicating resentment at being subjected to training by facilitator he didn't initially recognize. Recognition came 40 minutes into the session when Christina presented case study involving state attorney arrested during family visit after parking legally near fire hydrant. Sullivan's face flushed as details accumulated: the false DUI accusation, the excessive handcuff force, the transport commentary captured on body cam. Christina's voice remained professionally neutral as she guided discussion of where the hypothetical officer's conduct had violated constitutional protections and professional ethics. Sullivan said nothing for the remainder of training, his humiliation complete. The other officers avoided eye contact with him, recognizing they were witnessing career destruction dressed as educational exercise. Christina concluded the session with emphasis on transparency as institutional protection not just for citizens, but for officers whose professional conduct would be validated by evidence when complaints were unfounded. Body cam integrity served everyone's interests except officers who needed darkness to hide misconduct. Friday morning brought final administrative actions. Bremer County officially terminated Sullivan's employment with forfeiture of pension benefits beyond his own contributions, denying him the retirement security most 16-year officers could expect. The termination letter cited decertification as automatic grounds for dismissal and referenced policy provisions prohibiting pension benefits for officers terminated for cause related to criminal conduct or constitutional violations. Sullivan's professional downfall was complete. Decertified, terminated, facing federal civil rights investigation, exposed as systematic racist through evidence he'd created himself by underestimating the authority of a woman he'd dismissed as just another black driver who wouldn't fight back. His welfare check call had been the trigger routine intervention that positioned him to encounter Christina's vehicle, routine basis leading to catastrophic bias-driven arrest, routine afternoon transformed into career-ending evidence. Christina spent Friday afternoon at her grandmother's house, the first extended visit she'd managed since her arrest 2 weeks earlier. They sat together in the living room, where Evelyn Cooper had waited that October afternoon, unaware her granddaughter had been detained 2 blocks away. The bread and milk Christina had carried had long since been replaced, but the faded fire hydrant on Maple Street remained rust orange, half forgotten, now symbolic of systematic abuse that had been hidden in plain sight for 4 years. Evelyn expressed quiet satisfaction with Sullivan's decertification, tempered by recognition that justice for Christina meant acknowledgement of injustice that dozens of others had experienced without her resources to demand accountability. Christina agreed, but emphasized that systemic change required more than individual punishment. It required institutional reforms that prevented future Sullivans from manipulating evidence and targeting vulnerable communities. The broader impact was already manifesting. Iowa's Attorney General had announced a comprehensive body cam auditing program for all county sheriff departments, mandatory firmware integrity checks, and revised retention protocols that prevented local deletion of footage. By Friday evening, victim case reviews had resulted in 23 conviction dismissals, 17 pending appeals based on newly discovered evidence of Sullivan's bias, and 47 civil claims being prepared against Bremer County for constitutional violations. The county's insurance carrier had already indicated settlement negotiations would be necessary given that Sullivan's systematic misconduct couldn't be defended as individual officer error. Sullivan faced the weekend from his home, no longer a sheriff, but not yet formally charged with federal crimes, existing in liminal space between career destruction and potential incarceration. His reputation was permanently destroyed. Media coverage had ensured that anyone searching his name would find the body cam footage, the victim testimony, the decertification findings. Future employment prospects had narrowed to jobs where background checks wouldn't eliminate candidacy immediately. The history of racial confrontations that had been documented but minimized during his career now appeared in news articles as evidence of pattern everyone had seen, but institutional protections had obscured. Colleagues who'd worked alongside him for years described him in retrospective interviews as aggressive and old school. euphemisms that acknowledged bias while maintaining plausible deniability about their own awareness. The institutional failure extended beyond Sullivan's individual misconduct to the departmental culture that had enabled it. Bremer County committed publicly to Oversight Change's Civilian Review Board with authority to examine complaints independent of internal affairs, mandatory bias training for all officers quarterly rather than annually, and community liaisons for minority populations to provide feedback on enforcement patterns. The reforms acknowledged that Sullivan had operated successfully because oversight hadn't existed to catch him before technological safeguard accidentally succeeded where human systems had failed. Christina reflected on the initial reforms rolling out that victims had begun finding closure through case reviews and apologies, and that Sullivan's decertification represented one ending, while institutional transformation represented ongoing process. Her arrest had been humiliating, but her authority had transformed that humiliation into catalysts for change that would protect others who lacked her resources. The body cam footage that had destroyed Sullivan's career would be used in law enforcement training nationwide as example of what technological transparency could achieve when implemented properly. Sullivan's systematic tampering demonstrated why audio control couldn't be left to individual officers. The firmware update that caught him proved that technological safeguards, properly designed, could overcome human manipulation. The hearing's conclusion and Sullivan's fall represented justice through method rather than spectacle, administrative process rather than criminal trial, evidence overwhelming rather than contested, outcome determined by Sullivan's own documented conduct rather than prosecution persuading jury. The machinery of accountability had functioned exactly as designed once the evidence existed to activate it. By Sunday evening, 2 weeks after Christina's arrest, Sullivan's career had been completely dismantled, his decertification finalized, his professional reputation destroyed by evidence he'd created himself through bias he believed was protected by tampering that had secretly stopped working 6 weeks before his catastrophic mistake. The faded fire hydrant on Maple Street stood unchanged, but the institutional response to what had occurred beside it would reshape Iowa's law enforcement transparency requirements for years to come. Christina's parking choice had been legal, her arrest wrongful, her authority underestimated, and her role in reform ultimately more significant than any courtroom prosecution could have achieved. Sullivan's fall was complete. The victims he targeted had received acknowledgement. The reforms he'd made necessary were being implemented. And the poetic justice of a firmware update he never knew existed had proven that sometimes technology succeeded where human systems failed, not through dramatic confrontation, but through silent preservation of truth that eventually, inevitably, demanded accountability. The Elias Transparency Protocol was formally adopted by Iowa's Law Enforcement Standards Board 6 weeks after Christina's arrest, its implementation timeline requiring compliance within 90 days across all county sheriff departments and municipal police agencies. The protocol's provisions were comprehensive. Mandatory quarterly firmware audits to verify body cam integrity, automated alerts when audio capture failed during any encounter, tamper-resistant logging that recorded all attempts to access settings, menus, and state-level retention requiring 7-year preservation of all footage with constitutional implications. The protocol's name had been Christina's suggestion, proposed during strategy meetings with Attorney General Morrison, where reforms were being drafted. Christina had argued that attaching her name would personalize abstract regulations, reminding officers that transparency requirements protected real people who'd experienced real harm when evidence could be manipulated. Morrison had agreed, recognizing that the Elias Protocol carried weight beyond generic policy designation. It memorialized specific injustice while creating institutional safeguard against future occurrences. Implementation proceeded rapidly across Iowa's 99 counties. IT contractors deployed updated firmware to 1,847 body cam units, each installation logged and verified through central monitoring system. The new firmware eliminated local audio control entirely, activated continuous recording from moment cameras were powered on, and created encrypted audit trails that documented every interaction with device settings. Officers could still review their own footage, but couldn't delete, edit, or disable any recording functions. The reforms faced predictable resistance from law enforcement unions concerned about privacy implications. Officers argued that continuous recording in locker rooms, bathrooms, and during meal breaks violated reasonable expectation of privacy. Morrison's office negotiated compromise that allowed privacy mode during explicitly non-duty situations, but required supervisor approval to activate and created audit trails showing when privacy mode was used. The compromise satisfied legal concerns while preserving transparency during all enforcement activities. Systemic changes extended beyond body cam protocols. Morrison advocated successfully for independent review boards in counties with populations over 50,000, civilian oversight, with authority to examine complaints without waiting for internal affairs clearance. The boards would have access to body cam footage, arrest records, and demographic data showing enforcement patterns. Their mandate was identifying systematic bias before it required state attorney arrests and decertification hearings to expose. The firmware update that had accidentally caught Sullivan became deliberate model for technological integrity in evidence preservation. Morrison's office published Best Practices Guide for Law Enforcement Technology Procurement, emphasizing tamper-resistant designs and state-level rather than local control over critical functions. The guide acknowledged that trusting individual officer discretion had failed as protective mechanism. Technological safeguards were necessary backup when human judgment or institutional culture failed to self-regulate. Victim case reviews continued through winter, each examination revealing additional examples of Sullivan's discriminatory targeting. By January 2025, 53 individuals had received formal apologies from Bremer County, 37 convictions had been overturned, and civil settlements, totaling $3.7 million, had been negotiated with plaintiffs whose constitutional rights had been violated through Sullivan's systematic racism. The county's insurance premiums increased substantially, as consequence financial penalty that would burden taxpayers for years, but that insurers argued reflected actual risk from inadequately supervised departments. Community healing in Waverly proceeded slowly. Town hall meetings providing forums where residents could express anger at being targeted or betrayal at learning fellow community members had experienced abuse they'd been unaware of. The meetings revealed divide between white residents who trusted Sullivan based on professional interactions that reflected his better behavior, and minority residents who'd learned to avoid certain streets or driving patterns that might attract his attention. The divide reflected national patterns authority exercised differently depending on who encountered it. Christina returned to Waverly in February for formal recognition ceremony organized by community activists who'd advocated for police accountability before her arrest, provided evidence making their concerns undeniable. She accepted their acknowledgement with characteristic professionalism while emphasizing that her authority had amplified impact that ordinary victims couldn't achieve. The ceremony honored her while acknowledging that privilege had protected her in ways unavailable to others Sullivan had targeted. The faded fire hydrant on Maple Street became unofficial memorial to the arrest that had triggered systemic reform. Someone had painted it bright red, replacing the rust orange oxidation with color that matched its intended appearance. Someone else had placed a small plaque at its base reading, "Justice requires transparency, the Elias Protocol, 2024. Christina had learned about the plaque through news coverage before visiting to see it personally. The gesture moved her more than formal recognition, grassroots acknowledgement that her humiliation had created change beyond administrative process. Sullivan's mandatory bias training had concluded in December, his completion documented but meaningless given his permanent decertification prevented any law enforcement role where training would apply. The training had been punitive rather than rehabilitative, satisfying sanction requirement, without pretending that 40 hours of classroom discussion would fundamentally alter bias cultivated over 16 years of unchecked authority. Sullivan faced ongoing federal investigation through spring as Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division reviewed evidence for potential criminal prosecution. The investigation proceeded slowly, federal standards requiring proof of willful constitutional violations beyond what administrative decertification demanded. DOJ attorneys indicated privately that prosecution was likely, but timing on certain federal cases required resource allocation that competed with other civil rights priorities. Civil lawsuits proceeded independently of criminal investigation, plaintiffs seeking monetary damages for false arrests, malicious prosecution, and emotional distress from Sullivan's targeting. His personal assets were minimal, law enforcement salary hadn't created wealth sufficient to satisfy judgments, likely exceeding $2 million across multiple plaintiffs. Bremer County bore primary liability as Sullivan's employer, but plaintiffs could pursue personal judgments that would follow Sullivan through any bankruptcy proceedings. Sullivan's life, post-decertification, involved manual labor construction work that didn't require background checks beyond criminal record, which remained technically clean pending federal prosecution outcomes. Former colleagues avoided him, media attention had destroyed social standing, and family relationships strained under financial and reputational pressure. The fall from sheriff to laborer was complete, though Sullivan's own conduct had created every step of his descent. Christina reflected in her Des Moines office during spring that institutional racism's takedown required both individual accountability, like Sullivan's decertification, and systematic reforms like the Elias Protocol. Individual punishment satisfied justice for specific victims, but didn't prevent future abuses without structural changes that eliminated protective mechanisms abusive officers relied upon. Sullivan had been caught through technological accident firmware update he'd never known existed, but future protection required deliberate design rather than fortunate timing. The poetic justice of Sullivan's downfall through technological karma resonated beyond Iowa's borders. National media coverage of the case emphasized the firmware update's role, prompting other states to examine their own body cam protocols for manipulation vulnerabilities. Several states adopted versions of Iowa's Elias Protocol, creating interstate momentum toward technological integrity and evidence preservation that individual departments had resisted implementing voluntarily. Christina's hidden identity as state attorney had amplified the underdog triumph. Media narratives emphasized that Sullivan had arrested exactly the wrong person, someone with authority to dismantle his career and expertise to understand how his scheme had worked. The irony satisfied audiences seeking justice through reversal of power dynamics. Sullivan had viewed Christina as powerless victim who'd submit to his authority. Instead, she'd been powerful oversight official who'd use his own recorded crimes to end his career. The narrative resonated because it combined individual vindication with systematic exposure. Christina's arrest was personal violation, but her response was institutional reform. Sullivan's punishment was deserved but insufficient. Only broader transparency requirements would prevent future officers from practicing similar manipulation in departments where technological safeguards didn't yet exist. By summer, Iowa's law enforcement had adapted to new transparency requirements. Officers complained about increased paperwork and reduced discretion, but body cam compliance rates approached 99% across agencies implementing the Elias Protocol. The technological safeguards were working audio capture failures that might indicate tampering dropped to near zero, and the few legitimate equipment malfunctions that occurred were quickly identified and repaired through automated monitoring. Christina drove to Waverly in late summer, 8 months after her arrest, to deliver keynote address at Community Forum on police accountability and transparency. She spoke from her grandmother's neighborhood community center, 3 blocks from where Sullivan had stopped her vehicle that October afternoon. Her remarks emphasized that body cam laws required citizen awareness and advocacy. Technological protections only functioned when communities demanded them and oversight boards enforced them. She described the firmware update that had caught Sullivan as an example of how transparency could work when properly implemented, but cautioned that technology alone wasn't sufficient protection. Human oversight still mattered. Community involvement still mattered. Reporting bias still mattered. The Elias Protocol created tools for accountability, but citizens had to use those tools by filing complaints, attending oversight board meetings, and demanding that evidence be preserved and reviewed. Christina concluded by acknowledging that her position had given her advantages. Most victims lacked legal expertise, professional credibility, connections to power structures that ordinary citizens couldn't access. Justice for her couldn't mean simply personal vindication, but required extending protections to everyone, regardless of their authority or status. The reforms her arrest had triggered represented progress, but ongoing vigilance was necessary to ensure progress didn't erode when media attention faded and political priorities shifted. After the address, Christina walked to Maple Street to see the painted fire hydrant with its memorial plaque. The bright red paint had weathered slightly over months, already showing hints of the oxidation that would eventually return. The plaque remained polished, someone in the community apparently maintaining it. Christina stood beside the hydrant for several minutes, remembering the October afternoon when Sullivan's emergency lights had activated behind her legally parked vehicle. The memory carried less anger than it had initially. Sullivan had been punished, victims had received acknowledgement, reforms were being implemented. The injustice remained real, but its consequences had transformed from individual humiliation into institutional change that would protect others. Christina's resilience had manifested not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient work of documenting evidence, coordinating with investigators, and advocating for systematic reforms that outlasted individual case. She thought about Sullivan's welfare check called a routine intervention that had positioned him to destroy his own career through bias he believed was protected. The cosmic irony had been perfect. Sullivan had been checking on vulnerable elderly when he'd spotted Christina's vehicle outside her grandmother's house. The call meant to protect had led him to violate, and the violation had exposed pattern that protection had obscured for years. Christina walked back to her grandmother's house, where Evelyn waited with dinner. They ate together at the kitchen table where Christina had typed her initial 19-page report, where they'd processed the arrest's immediate aftermath, where they now discussed the reforms that had resulted. Evelyn expressed pride in her granddaughter's resilience and in the changes that might prevent other families from experiencing similar injustice. The conversation turned to legacy, what would remain after media attention faded, and Sullivan's case became a historical footnote in Iowa law enforcement history. Christina believed the Elias Protocol would endure because it served practical purpose beyond her individual case. The technological safeguards protected good officers whose conduct would be vindicated by footage, while exposing abusive officers who'd relied on evidence manipulation. The protocol wasn't about distrust, but about creating an objective record that served everyone's interests, except those who needed darkness to operate. As evening settled over Waverly, Christina drove back toward Des Moines, passing the painted fire hydrant one final time. The symbol was apt, something overlooked, half forgotten, in need of maintenance and attention, that had become witness to abuse and catalyst for reform. Sullivan had viewed the hydrant as pretext for intervention. It had become monument to his downfall and to the transparency requirements that had exposed him. Iowa's law enforcement continued adapting to post-Elias reforms, officers learning that body cam integrity wasn't threatening if conduct met professional standards. Complaints that had previously been he said, she said disputes now had objective documentation to validate or disprove. Genuine police work was validated while misconduct was exposed. The system was functioning closer to how transparency advocates had always argued it should. Christina's story became training case study in law enforcement academies nationwide, example of how technological safeguards combined with proper oversight could expose systematic abuse that individual complaints couldn't prove alone. Her dual role as victim and state attorney made the case pedagogically valuable. It demonstrated that authority could be underestimated, that bias could blind officers to consequences, and that evidence preservation was ultimate protection for truth. Sullivan's legacy was cautionary tale, 16-year career destroyed through systematic racism that he believed was protected by evidence tampering, undermined by firmware update he never knew existed, exposed through arrest of exactly the wrong target, whose authority made his misconduct consequential beyond individual case. The warning to other officers was explicit, transparency requirements were strengthening, technological safeguards were eliminating manipulation opportunities, and bias-driven enforcement would trigger career-ending accountability. The reforms and legacy extended beyond Iowa's borders, as other states examined their own body cam protocols and adopted elements of the Elias Transparency Protocol. The systematic changes Christina's arrest had triggered represented progress toward accountability that had been demanded for decades, but that technological solutions were finally enabling. Sullivan's accidental exposure through firmware he didn't know existed had proven that transparency could work when properly designed. As Christina drove away from Waverly toward Des Moines, the autumn landscape rolling past her windows, she reflected on the 8 months since her arrest and the institutional transformation that had resulted. The humiliation had been real, the violation genuine, the racial targeting familiar to anyone who'd lived while black in America. But her position had transformed that familiar experience into catalyst for change, not just punishment for Sullivan, but protection for future victims through technological safeguards that eliminated the evidence manipulation he'd relied upon. The story emphasized advocacy for body cam laws and reporting bias, leaving legacy of resilience and reform in Iowa. Christina's arrest, beside a faded fire hydrant, had exposed systematic abuse, triggered decertification of abusive officer, and created transparency protocol that would protect vulnerable communities for years to come. The poetic justice was complete. Sullivan's attempt to control evidence had been defeated by technology he didn't understand. His targeting of underestimated authority had destroyed his career, and his welfare check call had positioned him to encounter the one person whose arrest would make his pattern undeniable. Justice had manifested through method rather than spectacle, through documentation rather than drama, through systematic reform rather than individual revenge. Christina's resilience wasn't dramatic confrontation, but patient work of ensuring her humiliation created lasting change. The body cam footage that destroyed Sullivan's career would protect countless others because it had proven that transparency, properly implemented, could overcome the silence that had protected abuse. The faded fire hydrant on Maple Street stood as monument to the moment institutional racism selected the wrong target, and the Elias Transparency Protocol stood as testament to the reforms that resulted. Christina's drive away from Waverly carried her back toward work that continued beyond individual case oversight, advocacy, and commitment to justice that protected everyone, regardless of authority they held or vulnerability they faced. The technological karma of a firmware update Sullivan never knew existed had become the unseen force that countered corruption, vindicated victims, and proved that institutional change was possible when evidence couldn't be manipulated and accountability couldn't be avoided. Christina's arrest had triggered reforms, Sullivan's career had been destroyed, and Iowa's law enforcement would operate under transparency requirements designed to prevent future abuses from being hidden in the darkness that Sullivan had relied upon for 4 years of systematic discrimination. The legacy was clear: power underestimated, truth as endurance, and justice as method, not spectacle, had combined to create institutional transformation that would outlast the individuals whose conflict had triggered it. Christina drove toward the future with quiet satisfaction that her resilience had made difference beyond personal vindication, that her authority had served purpose larger than professional advancement, and that her grandmother's neighborhood in Waverly was safer because systematic abuse had been exposed and reforms had been implemented to prevent its continuation. The story ended not with dramatic conclusion, but with ongoing work, victims finding closure, reforms being implemented, communities healing, and technological safeguards protecting truth against future attempts at manipulation. Sullivan's downfall was complete, Christina's vindication was secured, and Iowa's commitment to transparency was strengthened through reforms that bore her name and would protect others long after media attention faded and individual case became historical record. The Elias Transparency Protocol stood as monument to what could be achieved when injustice was documented thoroughly enough to demand institutional response, when authority was underestimated enough to transform individual humiliation into systematic reform, and when technological safeguards proved that transparency could overcome the silence that had protected abuse for too long. Christina's legacy was secure state attorney who'd been wrongfully arrested and had used that injustice to create reforms protecting everyone who followed, whose resilience had manifested in patient work of documentation and advocacy, whose story proved that justice sometimes required being the wrong person to target at exactly the right moment to make systematic abuse undeniable. The drive toward Des Moines continued through autumn landscape, carrying Christina back to work that extended beyond individual triumph toward institutional transformation that would protect vulnerable communities through transparency requirements that Sullivan's downfall had made inevitable.
If you liked this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.